Now, Professor Radhika Balakrishnan says GDP is an outdated way of measuring the health of an economy. She argues that the method does not reflect the health of the people or the planet. Professor now joins us from New Brunswick in Canada to have this discussion with us. Prof, thank you so much for your time and for joining us this evening. Let's begin with you explaining what GDP measures and why it's traditionally being viewed as a key indicator of economic health.
Thank you for having me. I'm actually in New York City, in the United States, just not Canada.
All right.
It's okay. So GDP is a measure of the total value of goods and services produced within the borders of a country. And it has traditionally been used by national governments, international agencies to kind of assess the health of economy in terms of how much is produced. And so, for example, when GDP goes down for a certain level of quarters, then you declare that the economy is in recession. And so the question is, given today and where we are in the world, is this still a useful way for us to think about evaluating the success of an economy? And I argue that it's outdated and we need to really rethink the way we evaluate an economy, not just on the production of goods and services, but other criterion.
So, Prof, in it being outdated, just speak to us in terms of what the primary limitations of GDP as a measure of economic performance are currently, and how does it fall short in reflecting the true health of an economy?
For example, so GDP is only about the production of goods and services within the borders of a country. What it does not do is it does not evaluate outcomes in terms of poverty, in terms of health, in terms of jobs. It doesn't, GDP can grow when there's conflict, which is not necessarily a good thing for any economy. And it can grow during environmental crises. For example, the cleanup operations after an environmental crisis actually increases GDP, but again, not good for the economy. And one of the things that it does not count is the unpaid care work that is generally done by women, which is a huge amount of work that is done. And, you know, more than 16 billion hours of work is done in terms of caring for children, caring for the elderly, that's been done around the world. And the ILO, for example, estimates that unpaid and care work and domestic work is about 9% of global GDP, but it's not counted. So I think, you know, GDP is an important indicator, but it really is not the end all in terms of evaluating an economy. And I think what we need is a real normative shift away from this kind of production and selling goal of an economy to really think about what is it that we want from the economy, right? Is it just the production of goods and services, or do we need something else as a way to evaluate the economy? And how do we judge whether it's working based on how people are doing, right?
Of course.
And for example, I live in a country with the highest GDP in the world and has incredible levels of poverty, access to health, access to education. And I'm sure you've all followed the recent elections in the United States. We have no idea what is going to happen in terms of public services and the kind of things that actually help people who are, you know, in poverty in this country. So even though this is the richest country in the world, we have incredible levels of inequality and poverty.
And so, Prof, I mean, with all that's been happening in the world with regards to the advancements in technology, why do you think we haven't found a way to shift in terms of how we measure GDP in the way that we do? Why are we still stuck in how we've been doing it all these years?
That's a really good question. I think one of the reasons we're stuck is the kind of hegemony of mainstream economic analysis, which is called neoclassical economics, and also just the idea that our economies are only supposed to produce goods and services and that we have to grow, right? And I think everyone in the world understands that this untamed levels of growth is causing serious climate crisis everywhere in the world. There's not a place. I literally got a text 10 minutes ago that there's a fire in New Jersey, and that the smoke is coming into to Manhattan. So there's not a place in the world that can escape from the kind of climate change that is a result of this untamed growth and need for production and we saw when the entire world economy stopped during COVID how incredible nature was very happy with our shutdown of the economy. And so I think we really need, it's a useful measure. I'm not saying we shouldn't use it, but we really need to look at what is it that we want from the economy? I mean, it's a very basic question that I ask all the time, which is, what is the economy for? Why do we participate in it? What is it that we do? And if it's not to enhance the well-being of people, then what are we doing? I mean, so because I live in the U.S., I'm a little fixated on the recent elections, but by Wednesday, the elections were Tuesday night. By Wednesday, the three richest men increased their value by $64 billion, right? So is this the value? Is this the kind of country that we want? Or is this the kind of world in which these are the evaluative mechanisms? We have oligarchs. The level of inequality is unprecedented in the world. And so unless we really look at a different way of evaluating the economy, we really can't judge it in the right way. And so many OECD countries are starting to look at well-being as an indicator rather than GDP. Actually, in the 70s, the UNDP started looking at the Human Development Index, which was trying to decenter GDP and say, hey, can we look at life expectancy? Can we look at educational level, health outcomes, gender equality, decreases in inequality as ways to look at the economy? That's been there in the UNDP, but it hasn't really taken off in terms of government policies.
Right.
So I think we need to look at well-being as an indicator, and as I said, the OECD is starting to develop these kind of indicators, and I think it just needs a lot more work.
And this obviously then leads to my next question, Prof. I mean, you're mentioning some of these indicators, the Human Development Index. Which ones really do stand out for you in terms of alternative metrics that you would propose for a better assessment of economic health? And how do these alternatives rather provide a more holistic view of well-being and sustainability?
So I think one of the new indicators, or actually an indicator that's been around that I've been doing a lot of work around, is to use human rights and human rights standards as a way to evaluate the economy. And so these are all, in international human rights law. And so can we use human rights norms as a way of fulfilling human rights norms as a way to evaluate an economy? So South Africa has really great signatures to lots of human rights covenants. Have they been used to evaluate the economy? Not very much, right? So if we were to say the right to health, the right to education, as ways in which you can evaluate whether the economy is doing well. Many years ago, I actually worked with the National Human Rights Commission in South Africa to look at macroeconomic policy and say, how do we look at South African macroeconomic policy by seeing whether it actually is adhering to the human rights norms that South Africa is signed to? And I can tell you that it was true at that time, which was, a decade ago, that it wasn't. And so, what kind of fiscal policy it can be evaluated in terms of its obligation to make sure that people's human rights are provided for. And so that is one way in which I've been doing a lot of work on human rights and economic policy, is to say, okay, we have all these agreed upon norms. Why don't we use it in terms of economic policy? Because most people, when they think about human rights, they only think about civil and political rights, which are completely important. But we need to really look at economic, social, and cultural rights. And as I said, South Africa has signed, actually, South Africa is one of the few countries in its constitution has all these obligations towards economic, social, and cultural rights. And so how do we take those and actually hold the government responsible and accountable for fulfilling those rights?
Most certainly. I mean, you touched, Prof, a little earlier on oligarchs and just the influence that they have over governments. Do you perhaps think that rather the way in which GDP is used currently to contribute to these economic disparities is really just in the interests of the minority?
Well, in the kind of economic policies that we're looking at right now, I mean, look, what is it, 0.1% of the world's population holds the wealth, more wealth than 94% of the population of the world. So an oligarchy is both in the north and the south. And the influence of the oligarchs are apparent all over. And I keep going back to the elections because it was only a few days ago. The influence of the oligarchs in the U.S. election was huge, right? I mean, Elon Musk is on stage with Trump saying that, you know, he paid people to vote. So yes, the oligarchy, I'm not saying that this has been true for the last 80 years, but since the 1980s, the inequality towards the oligarchs has gotten worse. And I'd say in the last 20, 30 years, it's gotten exponential.
Right.
And we need regulation. We need to regulate the oligarchs. They're not paying taxes. Governments don't have enough money to pay their bills. And then we have international institutions that are cutting government's ability to conduct policy that would fulfill economic and social and cultural rights.
Of course. Prof, very quickly and lastly, how well do you think the general public understands the limitations of GDP? What can we do to improve awareness and educate people about these alternative measures of economic health?
That's such an important question. And I think one of the things that we need to do is to popularize progressive economic policy. I think most of the media really only focuses on sort of issues of mainstream economics. And I think to make popular too, and it's, and economics is always thought of as some kind of, voodoo science that only certain economists can understand. It's actually the most important issue in our time. And I think it's really important that we spend more time really making very important economic concepts understandable to people so that they can understand what it is policymakers are saying and how it affects them personally. For example, again, one of the issues that happened in the elections were people didn't understand inflation. Why was there inflation? They voted for a person who's going to have nothing to do with reducing inflation, if not anything, increasing it. But I've tried a lot in terms of popular education of economics, and I think that's one of the things that we all need to do. And as media, we need to do that much more.
Most certainly. Prof, thank you so much for your time. A very enlightening conversation with regards to how we view the GDP. We certainly appreciate your time this evening.